In today's first reading from the book of Exodus, Moses is on the top of Mount Sinai receiving the Ten Commandments when God informs him that the people have already turned away from God and that God is ready to destroy them for crafting a graven image, the golden calf, which they are now worshiping. And God gives three reasons. Well, Moses gives God three reasons not to destroy the people. First, he says that God has worked so hard to bring the people out of Egypt. Why should he give up on them now? Second, he tells God that God's reputation is at stake, because if he destroys the people, then the Egyptians will simply say that he is a God who brought out his people into the desert to destroy them. And finally, in response to God's promise to make a great people out of Moses, Moses said that, "No, God, you made your promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so you should keep your promise to them." And after hearing Moses' arguments, God decides to relent and not to punish the people. And it seems to me from this story we can conclude one of two or maybe both things about our relationship with God. First, we can conclude that God can be reasoned with, that he was bent on destroying his people, and yet Moses was able to argue and reason him out of it. And if Moses can do that with God, then maybe we can do it with God as well. So that's an argument for prayer, that we should always place our needs before God, and we should always argue with God as to why those things would be good to be granted. But the other option is to consider that maybe this exchange between God and Moses was really about God testing Moses to see if Moses really understood who God was and what God was all about. And if that's the case, then in our own struggles, God is testing us. And he's asking us to remember that even though we may be struggling at times with whatever might be the challenge before us, that God has worked hard to care for us and to save us, and that God will not abandon us after having taken this far. He's causing us to remember that we don't believe that God has brought us this far only to leave us. He also challenges us to remember that in our own struggles, God's name will always be vindicated, that God is a great God and will show his greatness to those around us. And finally, he teaches us that God will remain true to his promises, that even though we cannot always see and understand what God is up to in our lives, we can depend that God will keep the promises he's made to us and to our ancestors. You see, in all of this, we must remember that God is always with us, no matter what struggles we encounter, no matter what pains we suffer, no matter what challenges we encounter. We must remember to pray and to reason with God, and we must also remember that God will never abandon us, that God's name will be vindicated, and that God will always remain true to his promises. Amen.